Week 11, you should have read chapters 34 through 38. We're back to the narrative about Jeremiah's life, likely written by Baruch, we believe. It starts with a situation involving King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. And it's depicting how Zedekiah doesn't know how to keep a covenant. He's unfaithful to his covenant. He leads the people in covenant renewal, and he leads the people to get rid of their slaves. There's several speculations about why he does this. Likely he was hoping that maybe he could stir God's heart to act favorably towards them, but then something changes, we're going to see later. That maybe he felt the threat of war from Babylon, and then they kind of got a reprieve, so he didn't really feel like the need to repent was so great. But at any rate, he leads the people in renewal, and he has them get rid of their slaves because they weren't supposed to be having their own people enslaved anyway. But then they renege on it. They wind up taking their people back as slaves. He undoes everything that he did to lead the people back in covenant faithfulness. And that narrative is contrasted with chapter 35. So chronologically, chapter 34 and 35 have nothing to do with one another, but they're side by side as a polemic against one another. Because what happens in 35 is another symbolic act where Jeremiah has a family called the Rechabites come to the temple. And what he does is he sets down bowls of wine before them and says, "Here, drink the wine." And they say, "No way. We've never tasted any fermented drink. We've never drank wine. Nobody in our household ever has." And this goes way back to a forefather some hundreds of years ago had commanded that his family would never be drunk, would never drink wine, would never build houses, and would never plant vineyards or crops. The importance here is not so much is that this family was doing something right or wrong. The importance was this family knew how to keep a covenant. Their forefathers had initiated this covenant, this decree for their line, their family line, and they maintained it. And that's what Jeremiah's symbolic act is showing, that unlike Zedekiah, who couldn't keep a covenant for any amount of time, this family was faithful to their covenant keeping. And then in chapter 36, we're talking about King Jehoiakim. So we're jumping back in time. There's no chronological order here. In this narrative, we read about the role of Baruch, that he was at a writing role for Jeremiah. So Jeremiah has Baruch write this scroll. The word of the Lord comes to him. He has Jeremiah write it. He has it read. So in this narrative, we notice that there are many people who heard this reading, heard this scroll reading. The people at the temple, Shaphan's son, the people, it says, many people, royal officials. The officials, from hearing it, was smart enough, and they knew King Jehoiakim well enough that they hid Jeremiah and Baruch away. Then they bring the officials together, and then they say, "We're going to read this to the king." So as it's being read to King Jehoiakim, he's taking out his knife and he's slicing off the scroll and he's throwing it into the fire to show just how much he cares about the word of the Lord. The king then gives an order to arrest Jeremiah and Baruch. The Lord tells Jeremiah what happened, and he tells Jeremiah, write it again, write another scroll, and this time include the fact that the king's going to die. So this second writing activity is perhaps maybe points to the reason why we have two versions of Jeremiah, and you talked about that in an earlier unit in the course. By chapter 37, we're back to Zedekiah. So we've jumped in time now up to Zedekiah. This narrative is about Jeremiah being thrown in prison, and it's possibly the backstory to chapter 34 whenever Zedekiah makes that covenant and frees the slaves. Jeremiah was falsely confused of defecting to the Babylonian army, and he was imprisoned, as we read in chapter 37. In verse 18, an example that Zedekiah often asked for the word of the Lord is noted, that he would send for Jeremiah and ask for a word of the Lord. And it was never a good word, but Jeremiah told him the truth. But Zedekiah let Jeremiah serve his time in the courtyard of the guard. So he was a little easier on him. He respected him as a prophet, I believe, but he still wouldn't obey the word of the Lord. In chapter 38, we see Zedekiah allows Jeremiah, even though he was sympathetic to Jeremiah, he allowed Jeremiah to be thrown in the cistern and left for dead. But Jeremiah gets rescued by Ebed-Melech, which basically means servant of the king. He's saved by the slave. And then by verse 14, Zedekiah is back asking for Jeremiah's word from the Lord again. Jeremiah tells him, if you surrender, you and your family will live. If you don't, then you won't. And he does not surrender, and his family, they meet a terrible death. It's very gruesome. But he was warned, and he chose not to obey. All right, and that's all I have for you this week. We're getting close to the end. Hang in there.